Sometimes life changes in a single heartbeat, catching us completely off guard when we least expect it. For those who've ever felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control, this story will speak to your soul. In the frontier town of Cedar Ridge, Clara Beaumont trips and falls into mountain man Silas McGraw's arms. She declares that his touch means they're legally married, according to old frontier law. He spent 15 years alone in the mountains avoiding people. She's a headstrong eastern heiress who won't back down from anything. Now they're stuck together whether they like it or not. In the harsh wilderness where survival comes first, their forced marriage might be exactly what they both need. Can two stubborn hearts learn to trust each other when everything depends on it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge, Montana territory, in the spring of 1878, painting the dusty main street in shades of amber and gold. This was a town that time seemed to have forgotten, nestled between towering, pine-covered mountains and rolling meadows that stretched toward the distant horizon. The air carried the scent of wood smoke from breakfast fires, the earthy aroma of horses, and that particular crispness that only mountain mornings could provide. Clara Beaumont adjusted her traveling gloves for the third time as the stagecoach lurched to a stop outside Hennigan's General Store. At 26, she possessed the refined bearing that came from Boston's finest finishing schools, but her green eyes held a spark of determination that her etiquette instructors had never quite managed to dim. Her auburn hair was pinned in the latest fashion, though several rebellious strands had worked free during the long journey west. She wore a deep blue traveling dress that had been pristine when she'd left Massachusetts 3 weeks ago, but now bore the honest dust of 1,000 miles. The gold locket at her throat caught the morning light, a delicate piece containing her mother's miniature portrait, painted when Margaret Beaumont had been young and full of dreams. Clara touched it unconsciously, a gesture that had become habit whenever she faced uncertainty. Inside that locket lay not just her mother's image, but the reminder of why she'd fled eastward society. Her mother had married for love, not convenience, and had paid the price in whispered scandals and social isolation. Clara had vowed to honor that legacy, even if it meant leaving everything familiar behind. "End of the line, miss," called the grizzled driver, his weathered face creased with what might have been sympathy. "Cedar Ridge ain't much to look at, but folks here are decent enough, mostly." Clara stepped down onto the wooden sidewalk, her heeled boots clicking against the worn planks. The town spread before her like something from a dime novel, false-fronted. Buildings lined a wide dirt street, their paint faded by mountain weather and endless sun. The Silver Dollar Saloon occupied one corner, its batwing doors already showing signs of the day's first customers. Across the street, a white-painted church steeple rose modestly above the surrounding structures, while the mayor's office shared space with what appeared to be both the jail and the barber shop. "Miss Beaumont, I presume?" A portly man in a black suit approached, mopping his brow with a handkerchief despite the cool morning air. "Mayor Josiah Thornfield, at your service. Welcome to Cedar Ridge." Clara extended her gloved hand with practiced grace. "Thank you, Mayor Thornfield. I confess your town is quite different from what I expected." "Different how, if you don't mind my asking?" She gazed around at the rough-hewn buildings and muddy streets, then smiled with genuine warmth. "More honest, somehow, more real than the places I've known." Mayor Thornfield beamed with civic pride. "That's what we aim for, miss. Honest living for honest folks. Though I should warn you, we still follow some of the old territorial laws here, traditions that might seem strange to someone from back east." Before Clara could inquire further, a thin man with kind eyes and silver hair approached from the direction of a small building marked with a mortar and pestle sign. "Doc Whitman," he introduced himself, tipping his hat. "I run the medical practice and serve as the town's unofficial historian. Mrs. Kowalski at the boarding house sent me to fetch you." How thoughtful. Clara gathered her skirts as they began. Walking. Mayor Thornfield mentioned old territorial laws. I'm curious about the customs here. Doc Whitman chuckled, shooting a meaningful look at the mayor. Oh, we've got some interesting ones, miss. Laws about property rights, marriage contracts, even rules about personal conduct that date back to the 1850s. Most folks don't pay them much mind anymore, but they're still on the books. Marriage contracts? Clara's eyebrows rose with interest. Frontier justice, Mayor Thornfield explained, his chest puffing with importance. Back when judges were scarce and preachers scarcer, folks had to make their own arrangements. Some of those old statutes are still legally binding, though they rarely come into play these days. The boarding house was a two-story structure with a welcoming front porch and window boxes filled with early spring flowers. Mrs. Kowalski, a sturdy woman, with flower-dusted hands and a warm smile, bustled out to greet them. Miss Beaumont, land's sakes, you're prettier than a spring morning. Come in, come in. I've got your room all ready, and there's fresh coffee on the stove. Over the next hour, Clara learned that Cedar Ridge was home to roughly 200 souls, most of whom made their living through ranching, mining, or serving the needs of travelers heading further west. The town had a schoolhouse, a modest library, and a weekly newspaper that sometimes arrived on time. What it lacked in sophistication, it made up for in the genuine warmth of its residents. Now, Mrs. Kowalski said, setting down Clara's second cup of coffee, what brings a fine lady like yourself to our little corner of nowhere? Clara had rehearsed this answer during the long journey. I'm seeking a fresh start. Perhaps I'll teach school or help establish some cultural programs. Boston society can be rather stifling for a woman with independent ideas. Doc Whitman nodded approvingly. Independent thinking is valued here, miss. We don't have much use for stuffiness. Speaking of independent, Mayor Thornfield said, you might want to avoid the mountain trails north of town, at least until you're more settled. That's Silas McGraw's territory, and he doesn't take kindly to visitors. Silas McGraw, Mrs. Kowalski clicked her tongue disapprovingly. Mountain man, been living up there alone for 15 years or more. Comes down maybe once a month for supplies, speaks to no one if he can help it. Keeps to himself, which suits most folks just fine. Is he dangerous? Clara asked, though something in her tone suggested curiosity rather than fear. Not dangerous exactly, Doc Whitman said thoughtfully. Just wounded, I suppose. Lost his whole family in a Sioux raid back in '63. Wife, 2 little ones. Never been the same since. How tragic. Clara touched her locket again, thinking of her own losses. Aye, it was that. Mrs. Kowalski's voice softened. He was different before. Friendly, helpful, the kind of man who'd give you the shirt off his back. Now he's like a ghost who occasionally needs flour and coffee beans. Mayor Thornfield cleared his throat. Point is, miss, best to stay clear of the mountain paths. Silas values his solitude, and we respect that. Clara nodded, filing away this information with the same attention she'd once given to Boston social hierarchies. But where society gossip had felt petty and constraining, these frontier stories seemed to pulse with real human drama and genuine emotion. That afternoon, she explored the town more thoroughly. At the general store, she met Martha Henderson, who ran the establishment with the help of her teenage son after her husband's death the previous winter. Martha's calloused hands and direct manner spoke of hard work and honest struggle, yet she welcomed Clara with the same openness the others had shown. Fresh goods come in on the supply wagon every 2 weeks, Martha explained, showing Clara around the cramped but well-organized space. Coffee, sugar, flour, the necessities, anything. Fancy, you'll need to order special from Denver. What about books, writing materials? Some. Doc Whitman orders most of the reading material. He's got a real passion for learning, that one. Martha's eyes twinkled. Course, if you're looking to start a school, you might talk to Reverend Miller. He's been saying we need proper education for the young ones. Clara spent the remainder of the afternoon at the small church, discussing educational possibilities with the earnest young minister. By evening, she felt more hopeful about her future than she had in months. Cedar Ridge might lack Boston's cultural amenities, but it possessed something her former home had lost, a sense of genuine community and shared purpose. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Clara stood on the boarding house porch and breathed deeply. The mountain air felt clean in her lungs, untainted by factory smoke or social pretension. For the first time since her mother's death 5 years ago, she felt truly free. She had no way of knowing that her peaceful new life was about to collide spectacularly with 15 years of carefully maintained solitude, or that a single moment of chaos would bind her fate to the most unlikely man in the entire Montana Territory. 3 days later, Clara had settled into a comfortable routine that felt more natural than anything she'd experienced in Boston's rigid social circles. She rose early, helped Mrs. Kowalski with breakfast preparations, then spent her mornings exploring the town and getting to know its residents. The afternoons were devoted to planning curriculum for the school she hoped to establish, working with books borrowed from Doc Whitman's personal collection. On this particular Thursday morning, the spring air carried an unusual restlessness. The horses at Murphy's livery seemed skittish, and even the town's dogs appeared on edge. Clara noticed the atmospheric tension as she walked toward the general store, her reticule swinging gently at her side. She'd grown fond of these morning walks, enjoying the way the mountain light revealed new details in the familiar landscape. Martha Henderson was arranging bolts of fabric in the store's front window when Clara arrived. "Morning, Miss Beaumont. You're looking particularly cheerful today." "I am cheerful," Clara admitted, smoothing her green day dress. "I received word yesterday that the Territorial Education Board approved my teaching proposal. We'll have our school by autumn. That's wonderful news. The children will be so excited." Martha's words were cut short by a commotion outside. Through the store's large front window, they could see a magnificent chestnut stallion careening down Main Street, its eyes rolling white with panic. The horse's elaborate saddle and silver-trimmed bridle spoke of expensive eastern breeding. Clearly, not a local animal accustomed to frontier life. "Dear Lord," Martha breathed. "That's the horse belonging to that fancy gentleman who arrived yesterday. What spooked the poor creature?" The stallion's broken bridle dangled loose, the leather, reins snapping wildly as the horse plunged and reared. People scattered from the sidewalks as the animal charged past the saloon, past the mayor's office, heading straight for the cluster of people gathered near the church. Without thinking, Clara rushed outside. Her heart pounded as she saw Mrs. Patterson trying to shield her 2 small children from the panicked horse's path. The elderly woman stumbled, nearly falling, as the stallion bore down on them. "Mrs. Patterson, move!" Clara shouted, hiking up her skirts and running toward them. She reached the woman and children just as the horse veered sharply, its hooves throwing up clouds of dust and gravel. Clara grabbed Mrs. Patterson's arm, pulling her and the children toward the safety of the church steps, but the sudden movement startled the already frenzied animal. The stallion reared high, his front hooves pawing the air dangerously close to Clara's head. She stumbled backward, lost her footing on the uneven wooden sidewalk, and felt herself falling. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. For a moment, Clara found herself pressed against a chest as solid as the mountain granite, breathing in the scent of pine needles, leather, and something indefinably wild. She looked up into eyes the color of winter storm clouds, set in a face weathered by years of mountain sun and solitude. The man holding her was tall and powerfully built, with dark hair that brushed his collar and a beard that couldn't quite hide the strong line of his jaw. His clothing was practical: buckskin jacket, dark wool shirt, and boots that had seen countless mountain trails. Everything about him spoke of self-reliance and barely contained strength. For a heartbeat that felt like eternity, they stared at each other. Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition she couldn't name. Then reality crashed back as the stallion snorted and pranced nearby, still agitated but no longer in full panic. "You touched me without permission." The words burst from Clara's lips before she could think. The intensity of the moment, the shock of being in a stranger's arms, the way her heart was racing, it all combined to make her speak without considering. Her words, "The law says you must be my husband." A collective gasp rose from the townspeople who had witnessed the incident. Mayor Thornfield, Doc Whitman, Martha Henderson, Mrs. Kowalski, and at least a dozen others stood frozen, staring at Clara and the mountain man who still held her in his arms. The man, who could only be Silas McGraw, looked as if she'd struck him with lightning. His storm-grey eyes widened, and he immediately released her, stepping back as if she'd burned him. "What in blazes are you talking about, woman?" His voice was deeper than she'd expected, rough from years of disuse, but not unkind. Clara straightened. Her dress with shaking hands, her face flushed with embarrassment and adrenaline. The frontier laws that Mayor Thornfield mentioned. If a man touches a woman without her permission in front of witnesses, and she declares it, then according to territorial statute— "Oh, good gracious," Mayor Thornfield interrupted, his face pale. "Miss Beaumont, you can't possibly mean—" "Is it true?" Clara demanded, her chin lifting with characteristic determination. She wasn't entirely sure why she'd made such a declaration, but something about this man's presence had shattered her usual composed demeanor. "Is the law real or not, Docky?" Whitman cleared his throat nervously. "Well, technically speaking, the 1852 territorial statute regarding unsolicited physical contact does state that if a woman of marriageable age declares such contact as binding, and there are sufficient witnesses to the declaration, this is—" "Insane," Silas growled, running a hand through his dark hair. "I was saving you from being trampled by a mad horse. That's hardly—" "The circumstances don't matter," Mayor Thornfield said reluctantly. "The law is quite clear. If Miss Beaumont chooses to invoke the statute, and there are witnesses to both the physical contact and the declaration—" He looked around at the crowd of townspeople, all nodding solemnly. "Then yes, it constitutes a legal marriage contract." Silas stared at the mayor as if he'd grown a second head. "You can't be serious." "I'm afraid I am. The old territorial laws supersede most federal statutes in cases of frontier justice. They were designed to protect women's honor in situations where formal legal procedures weren't available." The mayor mopped his brow with his handkerchief. "The contract is binding for 1 full year, after which either party may dissolve it if they choose." 1 year. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. In her agitation and embarrassment, she'd invoked a law she barely understood. "I didn't realize—" "The law stands as written," Doc Whitman said gently. "Though I should mention that the couple must cohabitate for the contract to remain valid. Separate residences would constitute abandonment and nullify the agreement." Silas looked from Clara to the assembled townspeople, his expression shifting from shock to something approaching. "Panic. This is ridiculous. I live alone on the mountain. I don't want a wife, especially some fancy Eastern—" He stopped himself, clearly recognizing that his words might cause offense. Some fancy Eastern what? Clara's temper flared, overriding her embarrassment. "Lady, is that what you were going to say?" "I was going to say stranger," Silas replied evenly, though his jaw was tight with tension. "I don't know you, and you don't know me. This whole situation is absurd." Mrs. Kowalski stepped forward, her expression sympathetic but firm. "Absurd or not, Mr. McGraw, the law is the law. Miss Beaumont invoked her rights as a woman under territorial protection, and you can't simply ignore legal statute because it's inconvenient. Besides," Martha Henderson added, "you did touch her without asking permission first. That's the crux of the matter." Silas's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I was preventing her from being killed, and I'm grateful for that," Clara said, her voice steadier now. "But the fact remains that you—" She took a deep breath, realizing the full implications of what she'd set in motion. Mr. McGraw, I apologize for putting you in this position. I spoke without thinking clearly. But you can't take it back now, Mayor Thornfield said regretfully. Once the declaration is made in front of witnesses, it becomes legally binding. The territorial courts would uphold it if challenged. Silas was quiet for a long moment, studying Clara's face with those penetrating grey eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Where exactly am I supposed to house a wife? My cabin has one room and barely enough provisions. For myself. We'll manage something, Doc Whitman said diplomatically. Perhaps some of the townspeople could help with... No. Silas's voice was flat. If this insanity is really going to stand, then she comes to the mountain. Those are my terms. I won't be paraded around town like some domesticated pet. Clara felt a shiver of apprehension mixed with something that might have been excitement. The mountain? My cabin is 8 miles north, up terrain that would challenge an experienced horseman. You'll need different clothes, and you'd better learn quickly how to take care of yourself. I won't coddle anyone, law or no law. The crowd murmured uneasily at his harsh tone, but Clara lifted her chin defiantly. I'm stronger than I appear, Mr. McGraw, and I learn quickly. We'll see. He turned to leave, then paused. Pack light. We leave at first light tomorrow. Wait, Clara called after him. Don't I have any say in the arrangements? Silas looked back over his shoulder, and for the first time she caught a glimpse of something that might have been amusement in his eyes. You invoked the law, Miss Beaumont. Now you'll live with the consequences. As he strode away toward his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that waited patiently at the hitching post, Clara realized that her quest for independence and adventure had taken a turn she could never have anticipated. She was legally bound to the most remote, intimidating man in the territory, and tomorrow she would leave everything familiar behind for a life she couldn't even imagine. The broken bridle from the runaway horse lay forgotten in the dust at her feet, its leather straps twisted and frayed. Like her carefully planned new life, it would never be quite the same again. That evening, Clara sat in her boarding house room, surrounded by the remnants of her carefully planned new life. Her trunk lay open, revealing layers of silk dresses, delicate undergarments, and impractical shoes that would be useless on mountain trails. She folded and refolded her few practical garments, 2 simple cotton dresses, a warm cloak, and the sturdy boots she'd purchased for her western adventure, while trying to process the magnitude of what she'd committed to. Mrs. Kowalski knocked softly and entered with a steaming cup of tea. How are you holding up, dear? I'm not entirely certain, Clara admitted, accepting the tea gratefully. This morning I was planning curricula for school children. Tonight I'm preparing to become the wife of a man I've spoken to for perhaps 5 minutes total. Silas McGraw isn't a bad man, Mrs. Kowalski said gently, settling into the room's single chair. Wounded, yes. Difficult, certainly, but not bad. Tell me about his family. Doc Whitman mentioned they were killed in a raid? Mrs. Kowalski's expression grew somber. It was 15 years ago, maybe 16. Silas had a homestead about 20. Miles west of here, closer to the Yellowstone River. Beautiful land, good for farming and raising cattle. His wife Emma was expecting their 3rd child. Clara set down her teacup, sensing the tragedy in the older woman's careful words. The Sioux were angry about treaty violations, rightfully so. Most of the raids targeted military outposts and supply trains, but sometimes, Mrs. Kowalski sighed, sometimes innocent folks got caught in the middle. When Silas came back from a hunting trip, he found the cabin burned, his wife and 2 little ones. Dear God. He buried them on that land, then disappeared into the mountains. Folks tried to help, tried to bring him back to civilization, but grief does strange things to a man. He's been living alone ever since, coming down only when he absolutely must. Clara touched her locket, thinking of her own losses. And no one's tried to reach out to him since. Oh, we've tried. Doc Whitman still leaves medical supplies at the trail marker when Silas is laid up with fever or injury. Martha makes sure his supply orders are filled without questions asked, but he makes it clear he wants to be left alone until today. Until today. Mrs. Kowalski studied Clara's face. You could contest the law, dear. Find some legal loophole. No one would blame you for not wanting to isolate yourself on that mountain. Clara considered this, surprised to find that the idea held no appeal. Would that be the right thing to do? Leave him to face this situation alone after I created it? You created it by invoking an old law to protect your honor. That's not a crime. But I wasn't really thinking about honor, was I? Clara said quietly. I was startled, embarrassed, and somehow the words just came out. Now a man who spent 15 years avoiding human contact is legally bound to someone he didn't choose. Mrs. Kowalski smiled knowingly. You've got a good heart, Clara Beaumont. That might be exactly what Silas McGraw needs. Meanwhile, 8 miles north, Silas sat in his cabin's single room, staring at the cold fireplace and wondering what in hell he'd gotten himself into. The space that had seemed perfectly adequate for his solitary life now felt impossibly small when he imagined sharing it with anyone, let alone a refined Eastern woman who probably didn't know the first thing about survival. His hunting knife lay on the rough wooden table, its blade catching the lamplight. The weapon had belonged to his father, passed down when Silas was barely old enough to understand its significance. The handle was worn smooth by generations of McGraw hands, and the steel bore the nicks and scratches of countless wilderness encounters. Like everything else in his carefully ordered existence, the knife had its proper place and purpose. Now that order was about to be shattered by a woman who'd spoken 4 words that changed everything. Silas picked up the knife, testing its edge against his thumb. The blade was sharp. He kept all his tools in perfect condition, but handling it reminded him of all the skills he'd have to teach his unwanted wife if she was going to survive mountain life. Hunting, tracking, food preservation, weather prediction, basic medical care. The list seemed overwhelming. He tried to remember the last time he'd held a sustained conversation with another human being. Months ago, certainly. Maybe longer. His interactions in town were limited to essential communications. Need coffee beans. Flowers getting low? Any mail? The idea of daily conversation, of sharing meals and living space with someone who expected social niceties, made his chest tight with anxiety, but there had been something in Clara Beaumont's eyes when she'd looked up at him, a strength that didn't match her refined appearance. She hadn't swooned or collapsed into hysterics after invoking the marriage law. Instead, she'd stood her ground and accepted the consequences with a dignity he hadn't expected. Still, dignity wouldn't keep her alive if she couldn't adapt to mountain life. Silas made a mental list of modifications he'd need to make to the cabin: a partition for privacy, additional bedding, more storage for women's necessities. The thought of accommodating someone else's needs felt foreign after so many years of pure self-reliance. He moved to the cabin's single window and looked out at the moonlit peaks surrounding his sanctuary. This land had been his refuge, the place where he'd learned to live with grief and find peace in solitude. Now a stranger would share it, bringing with her all the complications of human connection he'd worked so hard to avoid. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of mountain light that made everything seem possible. Clara had barely slept, but she felt oddly energetic as she dressed in her most practical cotton dress and gathered her meager belongings. Mrs. Kowalski had packed food for the journey, along with warm blankets and extra medical supplies. "Remember," Doc Whitman said, as he helped secure her small trunk to the pack mule Silas had brought, "if you need anything, medical attention, supplies, or just someone to talk to, you can always come to town. This arrangement doesn't make you a prisoner." Clara nodded, though she wondered if leaving the mountain would be as simple as Doc Whitman suggested. Silas appeared to be a man who valued consistency and routine. Frequent trips to town probably wouldn't fit his lifestyle, Silas himself stood beside his horse, checking straps and gear with methodical precision. He'd spoken barely a dozen words since arriving at dawn, answering questions with nods or short phrases. Clara watched him work, noting the efficient way he moved, the obvious competence in every gesture. Whatever else Silas McGraw might be, he was clearly someone who understood his environment completely. "You'll want to ride astride," he said without looking up from his work. "Side saddle won't work on mountain trails." Clara felt her cheeks warm. Riding astride meant hiking her skirts in a way that would have scandalized Boston society. "I've never—" "You'll learn." He led a gentle-looking mare toward her. "This is patience. She's steady and won't spook easily. Keep the reins loose unless you need to turn or stop." Clara approached the mare cautiously, running her hand along the animal's neck. Patience wickered softly and nuzzled her shoulder, which Clara took as a good sign. "Here," Silas said, coming to stand beside her. Clara caught her breath as he placed his hands at her waist, lifting her onto the horse with surprising gentleness. "Foot in the stirrup, settle your weight, find your balance." His touch was brief and completely practical, but Clara felt that same jolt of awareness she'd experienced the day before. She arranged her skirts as modestly as possible and tried to look competent. "We'll take it slow the first few miles," Silas said, swinging onto his own horse with fluid ease. "The trail gets steep once we leave the valley." As they rode away from Cedar Ridge, Clara felt the eyes of half the town watching their departure. Mrs. Kowalski waved from the boarding house porch, and Doc Whitman called out final words of encouragement. Then the buildings fell behind them, and Clara found herself facing the vast wilderness that would be her new home. The trail wound through meadows bright with wildflowers, then began climbing steadily through stands of aspen and pine. Silas rode ahead, occasionally glancing back to check her progress, but offering no conversation. Clara tried to focus on riding technique and the stunning scenery, but her mind kept returning to the same question. What kind of life was she riding toward? After 2 hours of climbing, they stopped beside a clear mountain stream to rest the horses. Silas dismounted and moved to help Clara down, his hands once again gentle but impersonal. She found herself studying his face, looking for clues about his thoughts or feelings, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "How much further?" she asked, stretching muscles that were already protesting the unfamiliar exercise. 4 miles. The last bit's the steepest." He handed her a canteen of water. "You're doing better than I expected." It wasn't exactly a compliment, but Clara felt pleased nonetheless. "I'm stronger than I look." "You'll need to be." Silas's grey eyes met hers briefly. "Mountain life doesn't make allowances for anyone, Miss Beaumont. Not for women, not for beginners, not for people who change their minds." Clara lifted her chin. "I don't change my mind once it's made, Mr. McGraw, and I think, given our circumstances, you might call me Clara." For the first time, she caught a glimpse of what might have been a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Clara, then, and I'm Silas." It was a small thing, but it felt like progress. The cabin that would be Clara's new home perched on a natural ledge overlooking a pristine valley, surrounded by towering pines that had probably stood for centuries. It was smaller than she'd imagined, perhaps 20 feet square, built from thick logs chinked with clay and moss. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a covered porch provided shelter from mountain weather. The setting was breathtakingly beautiful, but Clara's heart sank as she realized just how isolated they would be. "It's not much," Silas said, dismounting and beginning to unload the pack mule, "but it's weatherproof and defensible." "Defensible against what?" Clara asked, sliding down from Patience with legs that felt like jelly after the long ride. "Weather, mostly. Sometimes animals. Bears don't usually bother people, but they're curious about food stores." He hefted her trunk easily and headed for the cabin door. "Wolves are more cautious, but they'll investigate if they smell weakness." Clara followed him inside, then stopped short at the threshold. The cabin's interior was even smaller than it appeared from outside, a single room containing a bed, a table with 2 chairs, a cooking area dominated by a wood-burning stove, and shelves lined with supplies. Everything was meticulously organized and painfully sparse. "Where exactly am I supposed to sleep?" she asked, trying to keep her voice level. Silas set her trunk down and gestured toward the bed. "I'll rig a curtain for privacy and sleep on the floor. It's not ideal, but it's temporary." "Temporary?" Clara's eyebrows rose. "The marriage contract lasts a year. The cabin situation is temporary," Silas clarified, his jaw tightening. "I can add a room before winter, assuming we both survive that long." Clara untied her cloak and hung it on a peg by the door, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "What's my first lesson in mountain survival?" Silas studied her for a moment, as if assessing her seriousness. "Cooking. If you can't feed yourself, nothing else matters." He moved to a wooden shelf and retrieved a leather-bound book with worn covers and pages yellow with age. Clara recognized it immediately. A recipe collection, but unlike any cookbook she'd seen in Boston's finest kitchens. "This belonged to Emma," Silas said quietly, placing the book on the table. "She adapted Eastern recipes for frontier ingredients and conditions. Everything in here can be made with supplies that keep well, and game that's available locally." Clara opened the book carefully, touched by the intimacy of sharing something so personal. The pages were covered in neat feminine handwriting, with notes and modifications scattered throughout. Venison stew with wild onions and preserved carrots. Trout cakes using cornmeal and dried herbs. Berry preserves without refined sugar. "She was very practical," Clara said softly. "She had to be. We were 20 miles from the nearest town, and supply wagons came maybe 4 times a year." Silas moved to the stove and began building a fire. "Up here it's even more isolated. I go to Cedar Ridge once a month if the weather allows, maybe less in winter." Clara absorbed this information with growing understanding of just how dependent she would be on her own capabilities. "What about medical emergencies? You treat them yourself or you die?" Silas's tone was matter-of-fact rather than cruel. "Doc, Whitman can't travel mountain trails in bad weather, and most emergencies won't wait for perfect conditions." He handed her a heavy cast-iron pan and pointed toward a barrel near the stove. "Flour, salt pork, dried beans, make something edible." Clara stared at the pan, then at the unfamiliar ingredients. In Boston, her culinary experience had been limited to supervising household staff and occasionally preparing tea and light refreshments. "I'm not entirely sure how to begin." "Then you'd better learn quickly. I'm hungry, and I don't cook for other people." The challenge in his voice sparked Clara's determination. She'd managed a household budget, organized charity events, and navigated Boston's complex social hierarchy. Surely she could manage frontier cooking. 2 hours later, Clara surveyed the results of her efforts with mixed feelings. The salt pork was edible if somewhat oversalted. The beans were undercooked despite lengthy boiling. Her attempt at cornbread had produced something resembling a brick, though Silas ate it without complaint. "Better than I expected for a first." "Try," he said, which Clara supposed was encouragement of sorts. "Tomorrow will be better," she promised, making mental notes about cooking times and ingredient proportions. After their modest meal, Silas rigged a curtain across one corner of the cabin using rope and a heavy blanket. The arrangement provided minimal privacy, but Clara was grateful for even that small concession to modesty. "I rise before dawn," Silas said, spreading his bedroll on the floor near the stove. "Mountain mornings are cold even in late spring. You'll want to dress warmly." Clara changed into her nightgown behind the curtain, acutely aware of Silas's presence just a few feet away. She could hear him moving around the cabin, banking the fire and securing the door. The intimacy of sharing such a small space with a virtual stranger felt overwhelming. "Silas," she called softly through the curtain. "Yes? Why didn't you contest the marriage law?" "You could have found legal grounds to refuse." There was a long pause before he answered. "Maybe I could have, maybe not. Doesn't matter now. But you clearly don't want a wife." Another pause. "Want doesn't enter into it." The situation is what it is. Clara lay awake long after Silas's breathing had settled into the steady rhythm of sleep. Through the cabin's single window, she could see stars brighter than any she'd ever witnessed, scattered across a sky that seemed impossibly vast. The silence was profound, no city noises, no human activity beyond the two of them. Only the whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional call of a night bird. She thought about the recipe book lying on the table, filled with another woman's attempts to create a civilized life in the wilderness. Emma McGraw had succeeded in building a home and family in this harsh environment, only to lose everything to violence and circumstances beyond her control. Now Clara was trying to fill a space that had been empty for 15 years, attempting to bridge the gap between her own inexperience and Silas's carefully constructed solitude. The next morning dawned grey and chilly, with low clouds clinging to the mountain peaks. Clara woke to the sound of Silas moving around the cabin, building up the fire and preparing for his daily activities. She dressed quickly behind her curtain and emerged to find him examining her impractical Eastern clothing with obvious concern. "You'll need different clothes if you're going to survive up here," he said bluntly. "That fancy dress won't last a week with regular wear." Clara looked down at her cotton day dress, which had seemed so practical when she'd selected it in Cedar Ridge. "What do you suggest?" "Men's clothing mostly. Trousers, wool shirts, sturdy boots. Maybe a divided skirt for when you need to look more conventional." Silas poured coffee from a pot that had been simmering on the stove. "I can modify some of my old clothes temporarily, but you'll need proper gear before winter." The idea of wearing men's clothing felt scandalous, but Clara was beginning to understand that frontier life required different standards of propriety. "Very well. What else do I need to learn?" "Everything. Water collection, food preservation, basic carpentry, animal care, weather prediction, emergency medical treatment." Silas handed her a tin cup of coffee. "And shooting." "Shooting?" Clara nearly dropped her cup. "Wild animals, Clara. They don't respond to polite conversation." Over the following days, Clara began her education in mountain survival with a determination that surprised them both. She learned to tend the fire properly, to recognize when water needed boiling, and to preserve meat using salt and smoke. Her cooking improved gradually, guided by Emma's recipes and Silas's patient if minimal instruction. The physical demands of frontier life were more challenging than she'd anticipated. Hauling water from the spring required strength she'd never developed. Splitting kindling left her hands raw, despite Silas's attempt to find her suitable gloves. Even simple tasks, like maintaining the cabin's cleanliness, required skills she'd never needed in her previous life. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, Clara began to find her rhythm. She discovered she had an aptitude for organization that served her well in managing limited supplies and space. Her natural curiosity helped her absorb Silas's terse explanations of wilderness skills, and her determination to prove herself capable drove her to persist through failures and frustrations. Silas, for his part, proved to be a competent if demanding teacher. He corrected her mistakes without cruelty, demonstrated techniques with patience, and gradually began to trust her with more complex tasks. Clara sensed that her willingness to learn and adapt had earned a grudging respect from the taciturn mountain man. Still, the tension between them remained palpable. They were bound together by law and circumstance, sharing intimate living space and daily routines, yet they remained strangers in every meaningful sense. Clara found herself studying Silas when he wasn't looking, trying to understand the man behind the carefully maintained barriers. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 35, and despite his hermit's life, he possessed a quiet intelligence that suggested education and experience beyond simple wilderness survival. Sometimes she caught him watching her, with an expression she couldn't quite read, not hostility, but not warmth either. Something cautious and guarded, as if he was waiting for her to reveal some fatal flaw or announce her intention to abandon their arrangement. Clara had no such intention. With each passing day, she felt more committed to making their unusual marriage work, if only to prove to herself that she was stronger and more adaptable than anyone, including herself, had believed possible. 3 weeks into their unconventional arrangement, Clara was learning to read the mountain's moods as skillfully as she'd once navigated Boston's social currents. The morning sky held a particular quality of light that spoke of afternoon storms, and she'd begun to anticipate Silas's routines well enough to have coffee ready when he rose and meals prepared at times that matched his work schedule. She was hanging laundry on a line stretched between 2 pines when she heard the distant sound of horses approaching through the forest. Silas emerged from the lean-to where he'd been repairing a saddle, his expression immediately alert and wary. "Expecting company?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. Silas McGraw never expected company. "Stay close to the cabin," he said tersely, moving toward the rifle he kept mounted beside the door, but the riders who emerged from the tree line weren't strangers. Mayor Thornfield rode in the lead, followed by Doc Whitman and a well-dressed gentleman Clara didn't recognize. The newcomer sat his horse with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any gathering. "Mr. McGraw, Miss Beaumont," Mayor Thornfield called out cheerfully, though Clara noticed he kept his hands visible and his movements deliberately non-threatening. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion." Silas didn't lower his rifle, though he didn't raise it either. "State your business, Mayor. We've brought a visitor from back east. Says he has important news for for Mrs. McGraw." The mayor's correction felt awkward, highlighting the strange reality of their situation. The well-dressed stranger dismounted and removed his hat with a flourish that immediately reminded Clara of Boston society manners. He was perhaps 40, with carefully groomed whiskers and clothing that spoke of considerable expense. "Reginald Ashworth," he introduced himself with a bow that seemed theatrical in the mountain setting. "I've traveled from Boston specifically to speak with Miss Clara Beaumont." Clara felt her stomach clench with apprehension. She knew that name. Reginald was the nephew of her father's business partner, a man she'd successfully avoided during her final months in Boston society. His sudden appearance in Montana couldn't possibly signify anything good. "I'm Mrs. McGraw now," she said carefully, moving closer to Silas. "Whatever business you had with Miss Beaumont will have to be conducted with my husband present." Reginald's eyebrows rose in apparent surprise, though Clara suspected the expression was calculated. "Ah, yes, I heard about your unusual marriage circumstances. Quite romantic, in a primitive sort of way." Silas's jaw tightened at the condescending tone, but he remained silent. "What do you want, Ashworth?" Clara asked directly. "To help you, my dear. I've brought legal documents that will free you from this unfortunate entanglement and restore your proper place in civilized society." Reginald reached into his jacket and withdrew an official-looking folder. "Your marriage, while perhaps legally binding under territorial law, can be annulled on grounds of duress and mental incompetence." "Mental incompetence?" Clara's voice rose dangerously. "A moment of feminine hysteria brought on by a traumatic incident," Reginald continued smoothly. "No court would hold you responsible for decisions made under such circumstances. I have witnesses prepared to testify that you were not in your right mind when you invoked that ridiculous frontier law." The town bell's bronze surface caught the afternoon sunlight as it hung from a sturdy pine branch near the cabin. Silas had rigged it there to signal Clara's location if she ever became lost in the surrounding forest. Now its presence seemed to mock the idea of community and belonging that it represented. This man from her past was trying to use legal manipulation to dissolve bonds that, despite their unconventional origin, had begun to feel surprisingly real. "I was perfectly rational," Clara said firmly, "and I'm not seeking annulment." Clara, dear, you can't possibly mean to remain in this wilderness permanently. Think of your future, your family's reputation. Your father's business associates are deeply concerned about your welfare. My father has been dead for 3 years. Clara replied coldly. His business associates have no claim on my decisions. Reginald's expression shifted subtly, revealing something calculating beneath his practiced charm. Actually, they do. Your father's estate included certain contractual obligations regarding your marriage settlement. If you fail to marry appropriately, within the terms specified— What terms? Clara interrupted, though she was beginning to suspect she knew where this conversation was heading. Terms that require your husband to be of suitable social standing and financial capacity to maintain your accustomed lifestyle. Reginald gestured dismissively toward Silas and the modest cabin. A mountain hermit hardly qualifies. Silas, finally, spoke, his voice dangerously quiet. Maybe you should explain exactly what you're after, Ashworth, instead of dancing around it like some dandified politician. Very well. Reginald's mask of politeness dropped slightly. Clara's inheritance from her father's estate, some $40,000, reverts to his business partners if she fails to marry according to the stipulations of his will. The marriage must be approved by the estate's trustees and must demonstrate the husband's capacity to provide appropriate social and financial security. Clara felt as if the mountain air had been knocked from her lungs. $40,000. She'd known her father left her provided for, but she'd never realized the inheritance came with such strings attached. No wonder she'd felt pressured to accept marriage proposals from men she didn't love. And let me guess, she said bitterly, you've been appointed to represent the trustees' interests? I've been authorized to offer you a solution that benefits everyone. Return to Boston, annul this unfortunate marriage, and accept my proposal. As your husband, I can provide the social standing and financial security the estate requires. You'll retain your inheritance, your reputation will be restored, and this unpleasant episode can be forgotten. Mayor Thornfield cleared his throat uncomfortably. Now see here, Mr. Ashworth. You can't simply come into our territory and start throwing around legal threats. I'm not threatening anyone, Reginald said smoothly. I'm offering Miss Beaumont, Mrs. McGraw, a choice. She can remain here in poverty and social obscurity, or she can return to the life she was meant to live. Clara looked at Silas, trying to read his expression. His face was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands remained close to his rifle. Was he angry about the threat to their arrangement, or was he relieved to have an escape route from their forced marriage? I need time to consider. This, she said finally. Of course, I've taken rooms at your charming local boarding house. I can wait a few days for your decision, but not indefinitely. The legal proceedings must be initiated within a specific time frame. After the visitors departed, Clara and Silas worked through their evening chores in heavy silence. She prepared dinner using Emma's recipes, now familiar enough with the process that her hands moved automatically while her mind wrestled with Reginald's revelations. You should take his offer, Silas said abruptly as they sat down to eat. Clara's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Should I? $40,000, Clara. That's more money than most people in Cedar Ridge see in a lifetime. You could live comfortably anywhere you choose, marry anyone you want. Anyone the trustees approve of, she corrected, which apparently means anyone except you. Silas was quiet for a moment, staring at his plate. I can't provide the kind of life you're accustomed to. This cabin, this isolation. It's not what someone like you deserves. Someone like me. Clara's temper flared. You mean someone weak, someone who can't adapt, someone who belongs in drawing rooms instead of mountains? I mean someone with choices. Someone who doesn't have to settle for less than she wants. Clara set down her fork and studied his face. What if what I want isn't what everyone else thinks I should want? Then you're a fool, Silas said bluntly, but his tone lacked conviction. That night, Clara lay awake behind her curtain partition, listening to the wind in the pines and thinking about choices. She had spent her entire life having decisions made for her by parents, by social expectations, by financial necessities. Coming west had been her first real act of independence, and invoking the marriage law had been an impulsive moment of rebellion against a lifetime of careful propriety. Now, she was being offered everything she'd supposedly wanted: security, social respectability, financial independence. All she had to do was admit that her marriage to Silas had been a mistake and return to a world where her biggest decisions involved which dress to wear to which social function. The thought made her feel physically ill. Over the next 2 days, Clara found herself paying closer attention to the life she and Silas had begun to build together. She noticed the way he'd started leaving wildflowers on the table after his morning walks, a small gesture toward making their shared space more pleasant. She observed how he'd begun explaining his tasks in greater detail, teaching her skills she might need during his occasional absences. She saw the subtle ways their routines had meshed together, creating a partnership that functioned smoothly despite its unconventional origins. She also noticed the careful distance Silas maintained, the way he avoided unnecessary physical contact, the polite formality that had replaced his initial hostility, the walls he kept firmly in place around his emotions and memories. He was treating her as a temporary resident in his life, someone who would eventually leave and therefore shouldn't be allowed too close. On the 3rd day, as they worked together to expand the cabin's storage area, Clara made her decision. "I'm not going back to Boston," she announced. Silas paused in his hammering and looked at her with surprise. "Clara, I'm not going back," she repeated firmly. "This marriage may have started as a legal accident, but I'm not treating it as a mistake anymore. If you want me to leave, you'll have to tell me so directly. But I won't be driven away by money or social pressure or other people's ideas about what my life should look like." Silas set down his hammer and studied her face with those penetrating grey eyes. "You're giving up $40,000 to stay married to a man you barely know. I'm choosing to make a life with a man I respect, and I'm beginning to understand. The money was never really mine anyway. It came with strings attached that would have controlled my choices for the rest of my life. And what if I don't want a permanent wife?" Clara met his gaze steadily. "Then at least I'll know I made my own choice about it, instead of having it made for me by lawyers and social conventions." For the first time since she'd known him, Silas smiled, not the slight quirk of lips she'd occasionally glimpsed, but a genuine expression of something that might have been admiration. "You're tougher than you look, Clara McGraw." "I certainly hope so," she replied, surprised by how natural her married name sounded when he spoke it, "because I have a feeling we're going to need all the toughness we can manage." That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing coffee and the comfortable silence that had begun to develop between them, Silas reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a tarnished silver pocket watch. The timepiece looked ancient, its case worn smooth by countless hands, its face yellowed with age. Most telling of all, its hands had stopped moving, frozen at 20 minutes past 3, though whether morning or afternoon, Clara couldn't tell. "This belonged to my father," Silas said quietly, turning the watch over in his hands, "and his father before him. 3 generations of McGraw men carried this watch through everything: wars, frontier settlements, family tragedies." Clara waited, sensing that he was working toward something important. "It stopped the day I found Emma and the children." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Clara could hear the carefully controlled emotion beneath his words. "Haven't been able to wind it since. Tried a few times over the years, but the mechanism seems to be broken beyond repair." "Time stopped for you that day," Clara said softly, understanding the symbolism. "More than stopped. For 15 years, I've been living the same day over and over. Same routines, same isolation, same refusal to let anything or anyone matter enough to hurt me again." He looked up from the watch to meet her eyes. "You've changed that. Whether I wanted you to or not." Clara felt her breath catch. This was the first time Silas had spoken openly about his past, about his feelings, about the walls he'd built around himself. "I never intended to disrupt your life," she said. "When I spoke those words in town, I was reacting to something I didn't understand." "What didn't you understand?" Clara considered the question carefully. "The way it felt when you caught me. For just a moment I felt safer than I'd ever felt in my life. That should have been impossible with a complete stranger, especially one with your reputation for avoiding people. But there was something in your eyes, something that recognized something in mine." Silas was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing the watch's cracked face. "Emma used to say that some people are meant to find each other, no matter how unlikely the circumstances. She believed in fate, in purposes larger than our own understanding. Do you believe that?" "I used to. Before," he gestured vaguely, encompassing the tragedy that had shaped his adult life. "After Emma died, I stopped believing in anything except survival. And now?" Silas looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before, vulnerable, uncertain, but also hopeful. "Now I'm beginning to think that maybe surviving isn't enough anymore." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Over. The following days, Silas began sharing stories about his life before the tragedy. His childhood on a farm in Ohio, his courtship of Emma, their early years building a homestead together. Clara reciprocated with tales of her own past. Her mother's death, her father's increasing business obsessions, the suffocating expectations of Boston society. "I always felt like I was living someone else's life," she admitted one afternoon as they worked together to plant a vegetable garden behind the cabin. "Everything was predetermined. Where I would live, whom I would marry, what my role would be. Coming west was the first choice I'd ever made entirely for myself." "Even if it led to an accidental marriage to a hermit?" Silas asked with what Clara was learning to recognize as his dry sense of humor, especially because it led to that. "You may not have chosen me, Silas, but at least you're not trying to remake me into someone else's idea of an ideal wife." They developed new routines that reflected their growing partnership. Silas taught Clara to shoot, starting with a small rifle and gradually working up to more challenging weapons. Her natural steadiness and attention to detail made her a surprisingly good student, though she still flinched at the sound of gunfire. "You'll get used to it," Silas assured her after a particularly successful practice session. "Shooting for food or protection feels different than shooting for sport." Clara also began taking on more complex household responsibilities. She learned to preserve meat through smoking and salting, to identify edible plants and roots, to predict weather changes by reading cloud patterns and wind directions. Each new skill built her confidence and deepened her connection to their mountain life. Most importantly, she and Silas began to function as genuine partners. When an early summer storm damaged part of their roof, they worked together to repair it without the careful politeness that had characterized their early interactions. When Clara injured her hand while chopping wood, Silas tended the wound with gentle efficiency and no lectures about being more careful. When he came down with a fever that lasted 3 days, she nursed him through it with the same practical competence he'd shown her. "You didn't have to do that," he said on the morning his fever broke. "Of course I did. We're married, remember, in sickness and in health, even if we never actually spoke those vows." "Clara." His voice was serious enough to make her look up from the broth she was preparing. "I need you to understand something about me, about what happened before." She set down her spoon and gave him her full attention. "When I lost Emma and the children, I didn't just lose my family. I lost my ability to trust in permanence, in the idea that anything good could last. For 15 years, I've been afraid to care about anything or anyone because caring means risking that kind of loss again." "I understand," Clara said quietly. "Do you?" "Because I'm starting to care about you, Clara, more than is probably wise. Given that our marriage is still legally temporary, In 8 months, you could decide to dissolve this arrangement and return to civilization, and I'm terrified that letting myself care about you will destroy what little peace I've managed to build. Clara moved to sit beside him on the bed, close enough to see the vulnerability in his grey eyes. What if I told you that I'm not planning to leave? That what we're building here feels more real to me than anything I left behind? I'd say that. People change their minds. That mountain winters are harder than you can imagine. That isolation can drive even strong people to desperation. Then I guess I'll have to prove you wrong. Clara reached out and took his hand, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. His fingers were calloused from years of hard work, scarred by countless small injuries, but they closed around hers with surprising gentleness. I lost people too, Silas. My mother, my father. Friends who chose social conformity over genuine affection. I know what it feels like to have your heart broken by people you trusted, but I also know that hiding from connection isn't really living. And what if I can't learn to stop hiding? What if 15 years of isolation has broken something in me that can't be fixed? Clara smiled and squeezed his hand. Then we'll figure it out together. That's what marriage is supposed to be. Two people helping each other become the best versions of themselves. That night, for the first time since their wedding day, Silas didn't sleep on the floor. Clara had suggested he could share the bed, platonically, with a rolled blanket between them, rather than continue to punish his back on the hard wooden planks. The arrangement was still awkward, but it represented another small step toward genuine intimacy. Clara lay awake, listening to his steady breathing, thinking about the broken watch that symbolized his frozen emotional state. She found herself wondering what it would take to get time moving again in Silas McGraw's carefully protected heart. More than that, she wondered if she was strong enough to be the person who helped him heal, or if she would eventually prove to be just another disappointment in a life that had already seen too many. But as she drifted towards sleep, Clara realized that her own heart was undergoing changes she hadn't expected. What had begun as defiance against social pressure had evolved into something deeper, a genuine affection for the complicated, wounded, surprisingly gentle man who was slowly learning to trust her with his carefully guarded vulnerabilities. Outside, the cabin, mountain winds whispered through the pines with the sound of secrets being shared. Inside, two people who had never expected to find love were beginning to discover that the heart's capacity for healing was far greater than either had dared to hope. 2 weeks after Reginald's first visit, Clara was hanging laundry when she spotted a familiar figure riding up the mountain trail. This time, he wasn't accompanied by the mayor and doctor. He rode alone, his expensive eastern horse picking its way carefully over the rocky terrain. Something about his solitary approach and the grim set of his shoulders made Clara's stomach tighten with apprehension. "Silas," she called, her voice carrying the warning tone they'd both learned to recognize. He emerged from the cabin with his rifle, though he kept it lowered as Reginald approached. Clara noticed that her husband, she'd begun thinking of him that way without reservation, positioned himself between her and their unwelcome visitor. "Mr. Ashworth," Silas said with cool politeness. "Back so soon?" Reginald dismounted and removed his hat, but his usual theatrical courtesy was absent. Instead, he looked like a man bearing news he wasn't entirely happy to deliver. "I'm afraid circumstances have changed," he said without preamble. "I've received additional legal documents from Boston that alter the situation considerably." Clara felt her heart begin to race. "What kind of documents?" Reginald reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio, this one bearing official seals and ribbons that spoke of serious legal authority. "A writ of annulment filed on your behalf by your father's estate trustees. They're claiming that your marriage violates the inheritance conditions so fundamentally that immediate dissolution is required to prevent permanent forfeiture of your legacy." "They can't do that," Clara protested. "I haven't agreed to any annulment." "They can and they have." Reginald's voice held what might have been genuine regret. The trustees have legal authority to act in your financial interests, particularly when they believe you're not competent to make such decisions yourself. Not competent? Clara's voice rose dangerously. How dare they? Furthermore, Reginald continued, raising his voice to override her protests. They've filed additional papers claiming that your marriage was obtained through fraud and coercion. They argue that Mr. McGraw deliberately created circumstances to entrap you into a legally binding arrangement for financial gain. Silas went very still beside her, and Clara could practically feel the dangerous tension radiating from him. What exactly are you accusing me of, Ashworth? Nothing personal, you understand. But the trustees have evidence that you were aware of Miss Beaumont's financial situation before the marriage incident occurred. They suggest you engineered the encounter with the runaway horse to force the situation. Clara stared at Reginald in stunned disbelief. That's insane. Silas had nothing to do with the horse, and he certainly didn't know about my inheritance. Neither did I, for that matter. Can you prove that? Reginald asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Clara realized with growing horror that she couldn't prove Silas's innocence any more than the trustees could prove his guilt. The entire incident had happened so quickly, with so many witnesses present, that the details were already becoming blurred in people's memories. This is about money, Silas said with deadly calm. Someone back east wants Clara's inheritance badly enough to manufacture fraud charges against a man they've never met. Reginald had the grace to look uncomfortable. The business partners your father left in charge of the estate have considerable debts, Clara. Your inheritance would resolve their financial difficulties, but only if it reverts to them instead of going to you. So they sent you to retrieve me by any means necessary. They sent me to offer you a choice, Reginald corrected. Annul this marriage and return to Boston as my wife, and you'll retain control of your inheritance. Remain here, and the legal challenges will proceed. Even if you eventually win, the court costs could consume most of your legacy. Clara felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Not literally, but in the deeper sense of a life that had finally found stability being threatened with destruction. How long do we have? The annulment papers require your signature within 30 days, or the trustees will initiate formal fraud proceedings against Mr. McGraw. If they proceed with the fraud case and win, he could face criminal charges for theft by deception. Clara looked at Silas, trying to read his expression. His face had resumed the carefully neutral mask he'd worn during their first weeks together, but she could see the muscle ticking in his jaw, the slight tension in his shoulders that spoke of barely controlled anger. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course, but Clara... Reginald's voice took on a more personal tone. You should know that the fraud case doesn't depend on your cooperation. Once the legal machinery starts moving, it will proceed regardless of your wishes. The only way to protect Mr. McGraw is to sign the annulment papers. After Reginald left, Clara and Silas worked through their evening chores in heavy silence. The tasks that had become routine and comforting now felt mechanical, performed by two people trying to avoid a conversation they both dreaded. Finally, as they sat down to dinner, Silas spoke. You have to sign the papers, Clara. She looked up from her plate, struck by the flat finality in his voice. Do I? I won't let you risk your inheritance to protect me from legal troubles I may not be able to fight. What if I don't care about the inheritance anymore? Then you're a fool. His tone was harsh, but Clara could hear the pain beneath it. $40,000 represents freedom, Clara. The ability to live anywhere, marry anyone, build whatever life you choose. Don't throw that away for a man who can't offer you anything but isolation and uncertainty. Clara set down her fork and studied his face. Is that really what you think? That you have nothing to offer? What do I have? A cabin in the middle of nowhere, no money, no prospects, and apparently a legal system that's ready to brand me a criminal for the crime of catching you when you fell. You have integrity, Clara said firmly. You have intelligence, kindness, strength, and the kind of loyalty that's been tested by tragedy and come through intact. You have the ability to survive in a world that would destroy softer men, and the wisdom to know what really matters in life. Pretty words, but they don't pay legal fees or provide security for the future. Clara stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. Stop it, Silas. Stop trying to convince me that you're not worth fighting for. I'm being realistic. You're being a coward. The words came out more harshly than Clara had intended, but she didn't take them back. For 15 years, you've hidden on this mountain, convincing yourself that isolation is safety. Now, when something good finally comes into your life, your first instinct is to drive it away before it can hurt you. Silas stood as well, his grey eyes flashing with anger. You think I'm afraid of being hurt? Lady, I buried my wife and children with my own hands. I know exactly how much pain the human heart can endure. Then why are you so determined to endure it alone? The question seemed to stop him short. Clara pressed her advantage. I'm not Emma, Silas. I'm not asking you to replace what you lost or pretend that our marriage is the same as what you had before. But I am asking you to stop assuming that caring about me will automatically lead to tragedy. And what if it does? His voice was quieter now, more vulnerable. What if everything I touch turns to ash and grief? What if loving you destroys you the way loving Emma destroyed me? Clara moved around the table to stand directly in front of him. Then at least we'll have tried to build something real together. At least we'll have lived instead of just survived. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his cheekbone. I'm not signing those papers, Silas. Not to save money, not to avoid legal troubles, and certainly not to protect you from the risk of caring about someone. We're going to fight this together, and we're going to win. Clara, no. This is my choice to make, and I'm making it. Whatever comes next, we face it as partners, as husband and wife, for better or for worse. For a moment, Silas looked as if he might argue further. Then something in his expression shifted, and Clara saw the exact moment when his walls began to crumble. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her with an intensity that spoke of desperation and relief in equal measure. God help me, he whispered against her hair. I do love you, Clara, more than is wise, more than is safe, more than I ever thought I'd be able to love anyone again. Then that's all we need to know, Clara whispered back. Everything else we'll figure out as we go. Outside the cabin, storm clouds gathered over the mountain peaks, promising a night of wind and rain. But inside, two people who had found each other against impossible odds held each other close and prepared to face whatever battles lay ahead. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Doc Whitman arrived at dawn, riding hard and looking more serious than Clara had ever seen him. Behind him came Mayor Thornfield, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by grim determination. We need to talk, Doc Whitman said, without his customary pleasantries. They gathered around the cabin's small table, where Clara noticed a handwritten document lying between them, their marriage certificate, the very paper that had legitimized their unusual union, and now stood at the center of a legal battle that could destroy them both. Reginald Ashworth left town yesterday, Mayor Thornfield began, but before he went, he filed preliminary paperwork with the territorial court in Helena. The fraud case against Silas is moving forward, whether Clara cooperates or not. Clara felt her stomach drop. How is that possible? Because the case doesn't require her testimony, Doc Whitman explained. The trustees are claiming that Silas knowingly manipulated circumstances to entrap an heiress. They have witnesses who'll testify that he was present in town immediately. Before the horse incident, that he was in a position to spook the animal, and that he showed unusual knowledge of frontier marriage laws. That's all circumstantial, Clara protested. But it's enough to build a case, Mayor Thornfield said regretfully, especially since the territorial courts are eager to crack down on what they perceive as fraud against Eastern investors and settlers. Silas, had been silent throughout this exchange, but now he spoke with quiet intensity. "What are my chances if it goes to trial?" Doc Whitman and the mayor exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Not good," Doc Whitman admitted. "You're a known recluse with no character witnesses, except for townspeople who barely know you. The prosecution will have expensive lawyers and sympathetic plaintiffs. A young woman allegedly victimized by frontier lawlessness. Even though the alleged victim refuses to cooperate with the prosecution, your refusal to sign the annulment papers actually hurts Silas's case," Mayor Thornfield said gently to Clara. "The court could interpret it as evidence that you've been further manipulated or coerced." Clara slammed her hand down on the table, making the marriage certificate jump. "This is insane. We're being punished for making our marriage work." "Unfortunately," Doc Whitman said, "success doesn't matter if the original circumstances can be painted as fraudulent." Over the next several days, they worked frantically to build a defense strategy. Mayor Thornfield arranged for a lawyer from Helena, a young man named Patterson who specialized in territorial law but had little experience with complex fraud cases. Clara wrote letters to everyone in Boston who might remember her father's business dealings, hoping to find evidence that the trustees had their own financial motivations for pursuing the case. Most importantly, they tried to find witnesses who could testify to the genuine nature of their relationship and Silas's character. This proved more difficult than expected. Silas's 15 years of isolation meant that few people knew him well enough to serve as credible character witnesses. "What about Mrs. Henderson?" Clara suggested as they brainstormed potential supporters. "She's known you longer than anyone else in town." "Martha's seen me buy supplies once a month for years," Silas replied. "That hardly qualifies as knowing my character." "Then we'll have to build character witnesses," Doc Whitman said thoughtfully. "People who can testify to the changes they've observed in both of you since the marriage. Evidence that this is a genuine partnership rather than a fraudulent arrangement." The strategy required Silas and Clara to become more visible in the community, exactly the opposite of what Silas's instincts demanded. They began making regular trips to town, attending church services, participating in community work projects. Clara taught reading lessons to children at the schoolhouse, while Silas helped with construction projects that required his wilderness skills. The effort was exhausting for both of them, but especially for Silas. Clara could see the strain in his face as he forced himself to engage socially after years of avoiding human contact. Yet he persevered, understanding that their future depended on convincing the community that their marriage was real and valuable. "You don't have to do this," Clara told him one evening after a particularly difficult day spent helping to raise a new barn. "We could leave Montana altogether, start over somewhere else. Running away won't solve anything," Silas replied, though his voice was tight with fatigue. "Besides, this is our home now. I won't be driven away from the only place where I've found peace, even if staying means risking prison." Even then, Clara reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "I love you for your courage, but I don't want to lose you to legal battles that we might not be able to win." "You won't lose me," Silas said with quiet conviction. "Whatever happens in court, whatever the legal system decides, you and I know the truth about our marriage. That's something no lawyer or judge can take away from us." As the court date approached, they received unexpected support from the community. Mrs. Kowalski organized a letter-writing campaign, asking people throughout the territory to share their observations about the McGraw's marriage. Martha Henderson offered to testify about the positive changes she'd observed in both Clara and Silas. Even some of the more conservative townspeople, who had initially been skeptical about the unusual marriage, came forward to express their support. "Folks can see that what you have is real," Mayor Thornfield explained as he delivered a stack of supportive letters. "Might have started strange, but it's grown into something genuine. People respect that." The night before they were to leave for Helena and the territorial court, Clara and Silas sat on their cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson. They had done everything possible to prepare for the legal battle ahead, gathered evidence, secured witnesses, retained legal counsel. Now all that remained was to face the judgment of a system that might not understand or value what they had built together. "Are you afraid?" Clara asked softly. "Terrified," Silas admitted. "Not of prison exactly, but of losing us. For the first time in 15 years, I have something worth fighting for. The thought of having it taken away." "It won't be taken away," Clara interrupted firmly. "Whatever the court decides about legalities, what we have together is real. It exists independent of any legal system. And if they send me to prison, then I'll wait for you, however long it takes." Silas turned to look at her, his grey eyes reflecting the evening light. "You'd wait for a convicted fraud? I'd wait for my husband, the man I chose, the man who chose me back despite every logical reason not to." They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over their mountain sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring uncertainty, legal battles, and the possibility of separation. But tonight, they were together in the home they had created, surrounded by the wilderness that had witnessed their unlikely love story unfold. Clara thought about the marriage certificate that would be examined and questioned in court. A simple piece of paper that had started as an accident and grown into the foundation of the most meaningful relationship of her life. Whatever tomorrow brought, she was grateful for the journey that had led her to this moment, to this man, to this life, that neither of them had planned, but both had chosen to embrace. The stars were beginning to appear in the clear mountain sky, each one a point of light in the vast darkness. Like their love, Clara reflected, a bright spot of hope in a world that often seemed determined to extinguish such illumination. Tomorrow, they would discover whether that light was strong enough to survive the scrutiny of courts and lawyers and social expectations. But tonight, it was enough simply to sit together and trust that some things were too real, too genuine, to be destroyed by external forces. Some bonds, once truly forged, could withstand any test that life chose to impose. The territorial courthouse in Helena was an imposing brick building that seemed to loom over the dusty street like a monument to civilization's attempt to impose order on the wild frontier. Clara felt dwarfed by its formal columns and heavy wooden doors as she and Silas approached with their lawyer, young Patterson, whose nervous energy did little to inspire confidence. Inside, the courtroom was packed with spectators drawn by the unusual nature of the case. Clara recognized several faces from Cedar Ridge: Mrs. Kowalski, Martha Henderson, Doc Whitman, and Mayor Thornfield had all made the journey to Helena to support them. But there were also strangers present, including several well-dressed individuals who could only be representatives of Eastern business interests. Judge Harrison presided from behind an elevated bench, his silver hair and stern expression suggesting decades of experience with frontier justice. The wooden gavel beside his right hand seemed to represent not just legal authority, but the power to determine their entire future with a single decisive blow. Reginald Ashworth sat at the plaintiff's table with two expensive-looking lawyers, their polished appearance a stark contrast to Patterson's rumpled suit and obviously provincial manner. Clara noticed that Reginald avoided meeting her eyes, focusing instead on the papers spread before him. "This court is now in session," Judge Harrison announced, his voice carrying easily through the crowded room. "We are here to consider allegations of fraud and coercion in the matter of Beaumont versus McGraw, specifically regarding the validity of a marriage contract formed under territorial law." The prosecution opened with a compelling narrative that painted Silas as a calculating predator who had deliberately engineered Clara's entrapment. Their first witness was a horse trader from Denver, who testified that the runaway stallion belonged to him and had been known for its nervous temperament. The animal was easily spooked, the trader stated. Anyone familiar with horses would have recognized its skittish nature immediately. Creating a disturbance that would panic such an animal would require minimal effort. Patterson's cross-examination revealed that the trader had never met Silas and was basing his testimony entirely on second-hand reports. But the damage was done. The prosecution had established that the horse incident could have been deliberately provoked. Their second witness was more damaging. A territorial clerk who testified that Silas had inquired about marriage laws during a previous visit to Helena, months before meeting Clara. He specifically asked about circumstances under which marriages could be formed without formal ceremonies, the clerk stated. He seemed particularly interested in laws regarding physical contact and witness requirements. Clara felt her heart sink as she realized how damaging this testimony sounded, even though she knew there had to be an innocent explanation. She glanced at Silas, who was listening with grim intensity, but showed no surprise at the revelation. Patterson managed to establish that Silas's inquiry had occurred more than 6 months before Clara's arrival in Montana, making premeditation unlikely. But again, the prosecution had planted seeds of doubt about Silas's motivations and knowledge of frontier marriage laws. The prosecution's final witness was devastating. A private investigator who had traced Clara's family connections and financial situation. Miss Beaumont's inheritance was a matter of public record in Boston business circles, he testified. Anyone making inquiries about eligible Eastern women would have discovered her financial status without difficulty. And did Mr. McGraw make such inquiries? The lead prosecutor asked. We have evidence that someone matching his description was asking questions about Eastern newcomers at various frontier trading posts and supply stations. Patterson objected strenuously, pointing out that the identification was based on vague physical descriptions that could have matched dozens of men. But the testimony created a disturbing picture of systematic stalking and financial motivation. When the prosecution rested, Clara felt as if they were drowning in circumstantial evidence that, while individually weak, collectively painted a convincing picture of deliberate fraud. Patterson began their defense by calling Mayor Thornfield to testify about the actual circumstances of the marriage incident. I was there, the mayor stated firmly. I saw the whole thing happen. Mr. McGraw was simply in the right place at the right time to prevent Miss Beaumont from being seriously injured. His actions were purely instinctive and protective. Did he appear to have any prior knowledge of Miss Beaumont's identity or financial situation? Patterson asked. None whatsoever. In fact, he seemed more annoyed than pleased by the legal complications that followed. If this was a planned scheme, he certainly didn't act like someone whose trap had succeeded. The cross-examination was brutal. The prosecution's lawyers methodically established that Mayor Thornfield had known Silas only superficially, that he had no knowledge of Silas's activities before the incident, and that his testimony was based on observations lasting only a few minutes. Doc Whitman followed with testimony about the positive changes he had observed in both Clara and Silas since their marriage. But again, the cross-examination emphasized the limited nature of his contact with Silas over the years. Martha Henderson's testimony was more compelling. She described years of brief but consistent interactions with Silas, painting a picture of a man who was withdrawn but honest in his dealings. He never asked for credit, never made promises he couldn't keep, never showed interest in town gossip or other people's business, she stated. If he was running some kind of elaborate scheme to trap wealthy women, he certainly kept it well hidden. But even Martha's testimony was undermined when the prosecution established that she had never seen Silas interact with women and therefore had no basis for judging his behavior toward potential romantic interests. As the day wore on, Clara realized that their defense was failing to counter the prosecution's central narrative. They could establish Silas's general character and the genuine nature of their current relationship, but they couldn't disprove the possibility that he had engineered their initial meeting for financial gain. The most crucial moment came when Judge Harrison addressed Clara directly. "Mrs. McGraw, you are the alleged victim in this case. Do you believe your husband defrauded you?" Clara stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom upon her. This was the moment she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The chance to speak truth in the face of legal manipulation, but also the risk that her words might not be enough to save the man she loved. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "I believe that love often comes to us in ways we don't expect, through circumstances we couldn't have planned. What happened between my husband and me may have started with an accident, but it grew into something real through daily choices we both made to trust each other, to build a life together, and to honor the commitment we had inadvertently created." Judge Harrison leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. McGraw, that's a beautiful sentiment, but this court must determine whether the original circumstances of your marriage were fraudulent, regardless of what developed afterward." Clara took a deep breath, knowing that everything depended on what she said next. "Then let me address the original circumstances directly, Your Honor. I am not a naive young woman who can be easily manipulated. I spent 26 years navigating Boston society, which required considerable skill in recognizing deception and self-serving behavior. If my husband had been attempting to defraud me, I would have recognized the signs. But you invoked frontier marriage law impulsively without understanding its implications," the prosecutor interjected. "I invoked it instinctively," Clara corrected, "because in that moment I recognized something genuine in the man who had risked himself to save me. My words may have been impulsive, but the recognition that prompted them was not." Judge Harrison consulted his notes. "The prosecution has presented evidence suggesting that Mr. McGraw researched marriage laws and made inquiries about wealthy Eastern women. How do you respond to that?" Clara felt Silas tense beside her, and she suddenly understood that he was about to speak, possibly to confess to something that would destroy their case. She placed her hand firmly on his arm, silencing him, and addressed the judge herself. "Your Honor, I would like to call my husband as a witness in his own defense." Patterson looked startled. They had planned for Silas not to testify, fearing that his taciturn nature and obvious discomfort with legal proceedings would work against him. But Clara sensed that only complete honesty would serve them now. Silas was sworn in and took the witness stand with the same grim determination he showed when facing any unpleasant but necessary task. Patterson questioned him briefly about the day of their marriage, establishing the basic facts from his perspective. Then the prosecutor rose for cross-examination, and Clara held her breath. "Mr. McGraw, did you research territorial marriage laws before meeting Mrs. McGraw?" "Yes." The simple admission sent a murmur through the courtroom. Clara felt their supporters' dismay and their opponents' triumph, but she kept her eyes fixed on Silas's face. "Why did you research those laws?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, and Clara could see him struggling with some internal decision. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was thinking about asking someone to marry me." The courtroom erupted in surprised conversation until Judge Harrison called for order. Clara felt her heart stop. This wasn't what they had discussed, wasn't part of any defense strategy they had planned. "Who were you planning to ask?" the prosecutor demanded. "A widow named Sarah Mitchell, who lived about 15 miles south of my cabin. She had 2 young children and was struggling to make it through the winter alone." Clara felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Silas had never mentioned any other woman, had never given any indication that he'd been contemplating marriage before their accidental encounter. "What happened to this marriage plan?" the prosecutor asked. "She died of pneumonia in February before I could work up the courage to approach her." The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. Clara realized that Silas was revealing something deeply personal. His first tentative step toward rejoining human society after 15 years of isolation. A step that had been cut short by tragedy. "So you researched marriage laws for another woman, then used that knowledge to entrap Mrs. McGraw?" "No." Silas's voice grew stronger. "I researched marriage laws because I was finally ready to stop living alone. When Sarah died, I thought I'd missed my chance. I went back to avoiding people, went back to my mountain, until you saw an opportunity with a wealthy Eastern heiress. Until I saw a woman about to be trampled by a horse and acted without thinking about anything except keeping her alive." The prosecutor pressed harder. "But you admit you knew about frontier marriage laws when Mrs. McGraw made her declaration." "I knew about them, yes. But I also knew she didn't understand what she was saying. I could have corrected her, could have explained that the law required specific language and circumstances. Instead, I let it stand." "Why?" Silas looked directly at Clara for the first time since taking the witness stand. "Because she looked at me like I was a man worth saving instead of a hermit worth avoiding. Because for the first time in 15 years, someone seemed to see something in me besides grief and isolation." Clara felt tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the full truth of their story. Silas hadn't engineered their meeting, but he had chosen to let her misunderstanding stand when he could have corrected it. He had protected her impulsive declaration because it offered him something he hadn't dared to hope for, a second chance at human connection. The prosecutor, sensing weakness, pressed his advantage. "So you admit you allowed Mrs. McGraw to believe something false about the law?" "I admit I was selfish," Silas said quietly. "I should have explained the law properly and sent her back to her planned life. Instead, I let her tie herself to a man who had nothing to offer except loneliness and hard work." "Your Honor," Clara called out, rising from her seat despite Patterson's attempt to restrain her. "May I respond to my husband's testimony?" "Judge." Harrison looked uncertain about the procedural irregularities, but nodded his permission. Clara approached the witness stand, pulling something from her reticule, a simple wooden ring that Silas had carved for her during one of their quiet evenings. "Together, this is my wedding ring," she announced, holding it up for the court to see. "Not the gold band that Boston society would consider appropriate, but a ring my husband made with his own hands because he wanted to give me something that represented our choice to make this marriage real." She slipped the ring onto her finger, where it settled with the familiar comfort of daily wear. "The prosecution wants you to believe that I'm a victim of fraud, that I was tricked into a marriage I didn't understand. But the truth is simpler and more complicated than that. Yes, I invoked a law I didn't fully comprehend. Yes, my husband could have corrected my misunderstanding. But we both chose to honor the commitment my words had created, even when it would have been easier to walk away." She looked directly at Judge Harrison. "Your Honor, fraud requires the intention to deceive for personal gain. My husband gained nothing from our marriage except responsibility for a woman who didn't know how to survive in his world. I gained everything, a partner, a home, and the kind of love that grows from mutual respect and shared struggle. The law is clear about the requirements for a valid territorial marriage," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "It requires witnesses, a declaration, and the couple's consent to honor the commitment. All of those elements were present. On the day we met, what wasn't present was any deception about who we were or what we could offer each other." Judge Harrison studied the wooden ring on Clara's finger, then looked at the legal documents spread before him. The courtroom was completely silent, waiting for his decision. "This case presents an unusual situation," he began slowly. "The prosecution has established that Mr. McGraw possessed knowledge that could theoretically have been used to deceive Mrs. McGraw. However, they have failed to prove intentional fraud, or that Mrs. McGraw was actually deceived about the essential nature of her commitment. Clara felt Silas take her hand, their fingers intertwining as they awaited the judge's verdict. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, Mrs. McGraw's testimony demonstrates that she understood and accepted the realities of frontier marriage, even if she was initially unclear about specific legal requirements. The marriage appears to have been entered into freely by both parties and has been honored genuinely in the months since. The judge picked up his gavel, and Clara held her breath. I find no evidence of fraud or coercion in this marriage. The annulment petition is denied. The marriage contract stands as legally valid under territorial law. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder, and the courtroom erupted in cheers from their supporters and angry murmurs from the prosecution team. Clara felt Silas's arms close around her as relief flooded through them both. They had won, not just the legal battle, but the right to continue building the life they had chosen together. Their marriage had survived the scrutiny of courts and lawyers and emerged stronger for having been tested. 6 months later, Clara stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching Silas work on the stone foundation of what would become their new addition. The summer had been good to them. Their garden had flourished, their relationship had deepened, and their place in the Cedar Ridge community had solidified in ways neither of them had expected. The foundation stones he was carefully positioning represented more than just additional living space. Each carefully chosen rock spoke to their commitment to building something permanent together, something that would last through whatever challenges the future might bring. Silas worked with the methodical precision she had come to associate with all his endeavors, but there was a lightness in his movements that hadn't been there during their early months together. The wall should be up before the first snow, he called to her, straightening to wipe sweat from his brow. By next spring we'll have a proper house. This cabin has served us well, Clara replied, though she was looking forward to having more space. It's where we learned to be married, Silas smiled. Not the cautious half-smile of their early acquaintance, but the full, genuine expression of a man who had rediscovered joy. It's where we learned to be partners. The being married part took a bit longer. Clara laughed, remembering their awkward early attempts at domestic harmony. Those days seemed impossibly distant now, though it had been less than a year since she'd tumbled into his arms and changed both their lives forever. Doc Whitman rode up the trail as they were sharing their midday meal. His arrival no longer the cause for alarm. It would have been in Silas's hermit days. These days, they welcomed visitors and made regular trips to town for both business and social purposes. Brought you some interesting news, Doc announced, dismounting with the careful movements of a man who spent more time with books than horses. Got a letter addressed to Mrs. Clara McGraw, forwarded from the territorial court. Clara accepted the envelope with curiosity. The return address identified it as coming from a Boston law firm she didn't recognize. It's from the probate court, she said, scanning the official-looking document. Apparently, the investigation into my father's business partners revealed extensive financial irregularities. They've been charged with embezzlement and fraud. Silas looked up from his food. What does that mean for your inheritance? Clara continued reading, her eyebrows rising with surprise. It means I'm getting it all back, plus damages for the legal expenses they caused us. The court has determined that the marriage challenge was part of their scheme to steal my inheritance. Doc Whitman grinned. Justice served, then. Better than that, Clara said, still reading. They're also requiring Reginald Ashworth to repay the money he received for pursuing the annulment case. Apparently, he wasn't as ignorant of their real motives as he pretended. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Clara had been willing to give up her inheritance to stay with Silas, and now she would keep both her money and her husband. $40,000, Silas said thoughtfully. That changes things considerably, does it? Clara asked, studying his expression. What would you want to do with that kind of money? What would we want to do? He corrected, and Clara felt the familiar warmth that came with being reminded that they were truly partners now. I suppose we could expand the ranch, maybe run some cattle, or we could travel, see parts of the country neither of us has experienced. Or we could do something for Cedar Ridge, Clara suggested. The town has been good to us. Maybe it's time to give something back. They spent the afternoon discussing possibilities, a real school building, medical supplies for Doc Whitman's practice, improvements to the church and town infrastructure. For the first time in either of their lives, they had the luxury of thinking about how to use wealth for purposes larger than simple survival. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been a restless spinster seeking escape from social expectations. Silas had been a broken widower hiding from human connection. Now, they were partners building a life together, contributors to their community, and examples of how love could grow in the most unexpected circumstances. "Do you ever regret it?" Silas asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. The path that led you here, Clara considered the question seriously. She had given up Boston's cultural amenities, social sophistication, and creature comforts. She had learned to cook over a wood stove, chop kindling, and shoot predators. She had endured isolation, legal battles, and the challenge of loving a man who had spent 15 years learning not to trust human connection. "Never," she said with complete certainty. "Not even the difficult parts. Especially not the difficult parts." Why especially those? Because the difficult parts are what taught us we could depend on each other. Easy circumstances don't build strong partnerships, challenging ones do. Silas reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "I used to think that loving someone meant risking everything. Now I understand that not loving someone means losing everything." "Your watch," Clara said suddenly, remembering the broken timepiece that had symbolized his emotional stagnation. "When did you start winding it again?" Silas looked surprised, then smiled. "About 3 months ago. I didn't even realize I'd started doing it until one day I noticed it was keeping perfect time. Time started moving again. Time started meaning something again. Days weren't just something to survive. They were something to build on." As full darkness settled over their mountain sanctuary, Clara thought about the marriage certificate that had survived legal challenges and was now safely stored in their expanded cabin. The document that had begun as an accident had become the foundation for something neither of them could have imagined, a love story that proved the heart's capacity to heal, to grow, and to find joy in the most unlikely circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to grow their partnership and contribute to their community. There would be the foundation work to complete, decisions to make about their newfound wealth, and the ongoing adventure of learning to share a life with another person. But tonight was perfect exactly as it was. Two people who had found each other against impossible odds, sitting together in the home they had built, surrounded by the wilderness that had witnessed their transformation from strangers to partners to lovers. Sometimes, Clara reflected, the best love stories were the ones that began with someone falling, literally or figuratively, and discovering that the right person would always be there to catch them. The mountain winds whispered through the pine. Trees with the sound of secrets being shared, but Clara and Silas no longer had secrets from each other. They had something far more valuable: trust, partnership, and the kind of love that grew stronger with each passing season, each shared challenge, each quiet evening spent building a life together, one careful stone at a time.